Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. This is episode 203, and we're going to be talking about the forecast for May of 2019. Let's see, what is the date today? The date is April 29th, Monday, April 29th, 2019, starting at 1:25 p.m. Joining me today is Austin Coppock and Kelly Surtees. Hey, guys.
Hey.
Hello.
All right. So, let's see, other things. Oh, yeah. For more information about how to subscribe to the podcast and help support the production of future episodes by becoming a patron, please visit theastrologypodcast.com/subscribe. All right, guys, let's get into the forecast. Hey, it's been a month since I talked to you last. How have you both been?
Hectic as.
Hectic. Kelly, you're getting ready to move to Europe and finalizing that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to say that I was getting ready, but we've just been dealing with some home maintenance repairs going on. So I can't even say that we're ready for the move yet, but it's in the background and it does change everything when you know you've only got a couple more months in this particular country. Things like, are we going to use all of those spices or that oil, or should we buy a smaller container? So even though, we're not necessarily doing major packing yet, there's definitely been a head shift for sure.
Right. That makes sense. And Austin, you are just coming back from a pretty heavy trip.
Yeah. My grandma passed about a week and a half ago. And so I flew out to Virginia, where my mom's side of the family's from, and spent time with family and had, there was a really beautiful service, and it was the nicest possible version of that, right? Still heavy, it's funerals and the dead and family and all that, but really everything that you could ask for. It was good. I got to go visit my grandma's family graveyard way up in the mountains for the first time. And I saw and touched my great-grandparents' graves, my great-great, and my great-great-great. So,
oh my goodness.
Yeah, that's, they're all in like just a little cemetery, maybe 150 plots. Just way up in the hills in a valley.
Talk about connecting with your ancestral line.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are there any sort of transits going on for you with respect to all that?
Oh yeah, it makes. I've worked it out extensively. The non-extensive version is, that Saturn South Node Pluto in Capricorn is very near one of my angles. Their Uranus is squaring the ruler of my fourth for family. Just one little piece of the technical dissection. I've been thinking a lot more about houses from houses. So if the fourth is mom, then the fourth from the fourth is your mom's mom, and that's where the Saturn South Node Pluto thing is for me.
Interesting.
Right? Yeah, and there's been a lot of stuff, and moving into a profection where the ruler is Mars in the ninth and needing to fly across the country because something, malefic happened, right? Which doesn't mean evil, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's not that it was a beautiful passing, but malefics are life. That's what a malefic does, is it talks about, someone passes rather than someone's born, right? So you have a malefic in the ninth and you fly for a funeral, right? And it's configured to the ruler of the eighth as well in my chart. So, it all makes sense. And I also started my classes, and that's been a lot of fun. I'm really excited about both my year 1 and year 2 students. I'm really excited that so many people committed to a whole year. I don't know. We've done 2 sessions with each so far, and I'm super into it.
Nice. That is good. And you also announced an event you're doing later this year.
Yeah. The one and only Gordon White and I have been cooking this up for a couple months, and we finally announced our North American event, As Above, which will be in Portland on September 14th. And it is the companion to our Melbourne event last year, which was So Below. And so As Above is basically a dialogue and a discussion between Gordon and I. That's the first couple hours. And then the next couple hours is dinner and drinks, and then we have the venue until about 2 a.m. So it is sort of a combination. It's a combination of highly refined thinking and talking, hopefully, about astrology, magic, paradigms, etc., and food truck based delicacies and open bar and occult warehouse party. It's sort of all of these things at the same time. It was announced publicly, I think maybe 9 days ago, and we're over 85% sold out already. So, don't dawdle. You can find more information about it at asabove2019.com. And so that's pretty exciting. It's fun to, unleash a master plan that you've been fiendishly crafting for a while. And the reception has been really good. And it's going to be, it'll be a night to remember. I hope to see you there.
Yeah, that sounds great. So people can find out more information at asabove2019.com. It's 85% sold out. So by the time most people listen to this, it will be completely sold out. So get your tickets soon if you're interested in signing up. Speaking of sold out events, NORWAC is coming up, and NORWAC is completely sold out for the first time ever in history. And I actually got an email from the organizer, Laura, saying thanks, because she thinks a lot of that's due to podcast listeners that are going to show up this year. So we are doing a podcast event as a pre-conference event at NORWAC the day before it opens, just after the first set of pre-conferences. And we only have like 200 seats, so that actually might get sold out as well. So we wanted to give everyone a heads up. They should try to get there early if they plan on attending that. Right, Kelly?
Absolutely, yes. I think we don't have an official doors open time, do we? Should we say 8 o'clock?
The event is starting at 8:30 promptly, right? Basically, as soon as the ascendant moves into Sagittarius. So we don't know what the door opening it is. It's going to be at least by 8:30, but probably by 7:30. But yeah, people should get there early in order to be sure they can get a seat. And it's taking place. What is the date again? It's Thursday, May
23rd. Sorry.
Okay, in Seattle at the NORWAC conference in one of the big rooms. I'm sure you'll be able to find it once you get there because a lot of people will be going there. And it's a free event, so just come and join us if you're a fan of the podcast. We're going to be doing a live Q&A, and we're actually soliciting questions now. If you'd like to submit a question ahead of time for our Q&A, we're not going to be able to answer all of them, of course, but we'll answer as many of the more interesting ones as we can. So you can submit your question to us through sending it through Twitter. If you want to email me your question at astrolog@gmail.com, or send them to Austin Kelly, and they'll send them to us at some point as well.
Yeah, you could probably send them to any of us, and I guess we'll just create a Google Doc or something, Chris, and we can review.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Q&A, I think one of you all said that we've never done a Q&A, all three of us together, right?
I don't think we have. I know Austin was saying we took a few questions after our live event at UAC, but that was just a few questions at the end. So I'm actually really excited for the three of us to get into, because the Q&As are always great for provoking really good discussions, and not that we need a lot of help with that, but we'll have a little bit more room to, roam in a live event. So that'll be fun.
Yeah, definitely. So send us your questions about astrology in general. I mean, should we set topic? We'll cover a wide range of topics, but should we give people any pointers about what would make a good question?
It shouldn't be a question about just your chart.
Right.
Yeah,
if it's only a question that relates to your chart.
Yes, a technique about a question about a technique, or a question about something that might relate to, more than just you, is a really good question.
Definitely. All right, cool. So that's going to be fun, and we look forward to seeing a lot of people at NORWAC in general. Kelly, you're doing a post-conference, and I'm doing a post-conference. What's your post-conference on?
My post-conference is on places of ease and pathways of frustrations, and it's about going deeper with natal aspects.
Brilliant. And you still have space left there? It's not sold out yet?
I don't think I am. So yes, if anyone's interested in that, I'd love to have you join us. And that's on Monday, the 27th of May. And what's yours called, Chris?
Mine is on synthesizing modern and ancient astrology and sort of providing a blueprint for starting to do that now that we have the revival of all of these ancient traditions that are intermixing with all these modern ones in the present time. So yeah, that's my
Do you
post-conference.
still have some space in yours, or is it full?
I have no idea. I assume it's full. If they let you buy tickets and you want to buy tickets, then give it a shot. If they
Yeah.
don't, then next time. All right. So that's NORWAC. Look forward to seeing everyone at the end of the month. Other news and announcements in terms of conferences. Kelly, you said something came up about SOTA?
Oh, yeah. So the SOTA Facebook page has made the official announcement that the 2019 SOTA conference is cancelled due to the organizer, Donna Van Toen, passing away late last year.
Oh, right.
So that was kind of expected, but obviously we hadn't had any official word. But just in the last couple of weeks, they did make it clear that there won't be a SOTA conference this year. Plans for 2020 are still up in the air, so we don't have confirmation on that as yet. But the family are still just dealing with the emotional side of everything that's been going on. So they weren't ready to commit to 2020 yet, but they did say that there won't be one for 2019.
Okay. And in terms of 2020, though, there is a big conference that's being planned that I just got some like front seat access to this week because the entire board of the International Society for Astrological Research flew out here over the past week for board meetings and for conference planning, and they're planning to host a huge international conference here in Denver next in September of 2020. So that's coming up. It's going to be really great. It looks like it's going to be a great conference with a ton of speakers flying in from all over the world. They just completed their first round of speaker selection for that in voting and picked their first 30 speakers. And yeah, I think you and I got in, right, Kelly?
Yeah, I was really excited and quite surprised that I got in on the first go. So I'm thrilled. I'm so excited for such a big conference next year. And Chris, you're there as well.
Yeah, I made it in on the traditional track. So thanks everybody who voted for me. It kind of sucked because the traditional track got packed with a ton of big speakers. It was like me, Demetra, Lee Lehman, Austin, Lisa, Michael Ofek, and like 2 other people. So it was like that was the highest competition. 1 and only the top 3 could get in. So I think they're still going to do other rounds of things, other rounds of like speaker selection that's in the process of happening now. And I'm making arrangements with them, and they're going to give us a space to do a large free podcast event at this conference as a pre-conference thing. So the 3 of us are going to be there for sure doing that. If you're up for it, actually, I should have run that by you first.
I'm like, oh, I love that, Chris. Yeah. I don't know. I will be. What about you, Austin?
Well, I wasn't my talk wasn't selected, so I'm going to have to get over my feelings, and which may involve bringing terrible devastation to the lives of all of those who voted against me. That's where I'm at now. We'll see. It
wasn't selected. Right. Wasn't selected yet. Wait.
Yeah, I mean, there's still multiple rounds, I think.
Well, if anybody would like there to be any astrological magic content at the conference, mine is the only talk that was proposed that's actually on astrological magic.
What was the title again?
It's called Calling the Planets, and it's comparing the way that the verbal component of calling the planets in the Hygromantia, in the Picatrix, and in Agrippa's 4 books of occultic philosophy, or 3 books.
You and your poetic titles, what if people just misinterpreted it as like literally trying to call the planets, and that was the issue?
Well,
yeah.
Yeah.
Crickets.
Well, if maybe it's not for them then.
Right. That could be the issue. All right. Well,
it's pretty literal.
But Chris, sorry, Austin, you would have been on the traditional track too then, right?
Yes.
Because that was a very hard track to select speakers from, I will say, right out of the gate. I wanted like all of them to speak. Not all of them, but most of them to speak.
Yeah, and that was what happened. And Lisa didn't make it in on that track, and Michael Ofek didn't make it in, and like 1 or 2 other people didn't. So don't feel bad, but there's still time. So we'll see what happens with the.
So I'll be in good company when we have our loser party.
Yeah. But it is going to be a good conference. So it's a long ways away right now, but I'm looking forward to it. And I've been doing interviews. I got to steal some of the ESAR board members like Kenneth Miller and Sam Reynolds to do an interview that came out already this month on the outer planets. And then there's another interview I did with David Rayleigh, who's the vice president of ESAR, about his work in bringing modern Western astrology to China. And that's going to be one of the first episodes I release in May that's being edited right now.
Fantastic.
Interesting.
I have to say I'm a little nervous because I did swing for the fence with my talk topic for ESAR in that I went for a talk on progressions, and I had a random thought, I'm going to email Aaron, who's my publisher, and say, can we get the book out by then? Because then I can do a talk on it.
You pretty much have to get the book out by then.
And now we have to.
Okay.
So that's it's just really putting the pressure on.
Good. I like that. And the theme of the conference is like the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, the great conjunction that's happening next year in 2020. And that's something you guys have been researching and talking about a lot recently as well, right?
Totally.
Yeah, I've been, it's been part of my, the year in reference to that has been part of my yearly for the last several years. Because it's such an important framing device for looking at what's 2016 like, what's 2018 like, what's 2021 like, right? There's the nature of the year inside itself, but then there's context. And that's I would say our best and clearest single system, which gives us context. And I'm giving my delayed talk on the Jupiter-Saturn cycle this coming Sunday, May the 5th, Cinco de Mayo. It was originally scheduled for the previous Sunday, but I ended up having to fly out and do family and funeral. And this will be the second time I've given the talk, so hopefully better. I think I learned a few things during the first one. People can sign up for that on my website, which is austincoppock.com. And even if you can't make it live, if you sign up, you will get a digital copy with the PowerPoint and my, questionable voice and all that. So,
awesome.
and that's, I don't have too much going on in May other than what I've already committed to. Lots of teaching, lots of readings, giving that talk, selling out as above. And then the Venus in Pisces series that I elected for Sphere and Sundry is due to launch on May 2nd. And so there's that as well. And I am a fan. I am the primary beta tester for all of that stuff. So pleasing indeed.
Awesome.
Super exciting.
Kelly, did you do a Jupiter-Saturn talk as well or something?
I did at the Astrology University 2020 Summit, which was mid-April. I had talked a little bit about the Jupiter-Saturn cycle in my year ahead talk because I do think, like you, Austin, it gives really good context. It sort of puts the whole Saturn South Node Pluto thing, it gives a framework for why that's absolutely relevant given the major change with Jupiter and Saturn. So yeah, that talk is now available as part of the Access All Areas Pass from the Astrology Summit via Astrology University. But yeah, Austin, you totally have to come to the ESAR conference because it's likely that it'll be my book launch, and you've been such a good supporter, aka kicking me up the proverbial to get that done. So it wouldn't be a book launch party without you there.
Yeah, I'm sure I'll be there.
You guys will be there.
I'm dramatizing my reaction to not being selected in the first round.
Well, also because Sphere and Sundry, I'm sure will have a presence there with their beautiful wares.
Maybe.
Okay.
There's not a whole lot of vending with Sphere and Sundry.
No, that's true. So,
Maybe.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
That is up to the proprietress.
Yeah,
although Sphere and Sundry will be vending for the first and only time so far at As Above.
Yes.
So little icing on an already delicious layer cake. One type of cake being me, the other Gordon, Kate being the icing. I don't know. And so the question is, what kind of cake am I?
Well, there'd be some chili in there for sure.
All
but also some buttercream.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
You can't do Cancer Rising without a little buttercream.
Oh my God, not at all. You cannot.
And so this is sounding like the awkward combination I am in reality, chili and buttercream.
But that sums up you, Austin.
Yeah, well, it's my job to figure out how to make that flavor profile work, I suppose.
You're doing a great job. And I think we're getting
you.
some confirmation here that Sphere and Sundry will only be vending it as above by special request. And that's it.
Awesome. All right. So I think that's all the news and announcements. We were going to do a few topics because we got kind of a short time frame for today before we got to get into the forecast. Which one did you guys want to talk on first? One of them that I know, Kelly, you'd mentioned being a topic of interest was the episode I did in episode 201, where we talked about dating astrologers as being like a funny thing since all three of us have different variations of that in common.
Yeah. I don't know. I thought it was such a great topic. I think I've listened to about the first half of that episode now.
Mhm.
And I really enjoyed the discussion. I thought everybody made some beautiful points. Some of the points that Eugenia was making around how she uses astrology very therapeutically, and then at the end of the day, she kind of likes to shut down from it, but her partner has a different approach. I really related to that too, because I find with my own work, I go through periods where I have, really intense client consulting periods where at the end of the day, I almost can't read anything more on astrology because I'm deep in that more, client consulting mindset. And then other periods where I'm researching or teaching, where I'm, reading all the books. But even though I did meet my partner at a conference at Denver 2008, he is no longer really super into astrology. So we do have a little bit of an imbalance where I obviously know a lot about astrology and he knows a little bit, but there is a bit of a gap between the two of us. So I thought some of the points that were made in that podcast around, when there is an imbalance of who knows what, like how you really hold that, because that's something that we do have to be really careful of around.
Yeah, your partner Peter's primary thing is tarot, right?
It is, yeah. Yeah, he's great with the tarot. Probably
I mean,
like
so
most super
that's
Scorpio
something at
charts.
least. So it's not like he's not open to metaphysical stuff at all. He just does like a different thing as his primary interest.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the points that I think was made in the podcast was how important it was to have that shared kind of worldview or shared sort of orientation. And
Right.
that's one thing I think for Peter and I, this is probably the first time that we've had that in our romantic relationship, and it makes a huge difference.
Okay, so you had been in previous relationships with like non-astrologers while you were pursuing astrology as a career or at least as like a major interest in your life?
Yes.
And was
And
that
that's
tough or what?
It's kind of weird. Yeah. I mean, my first sort of serious boyfriend, who was the one I was with when I first was studying astrology, he was in the finance industry and, much more of a dry personality type. So I didn't really get that sense of respect from him around the value of astrology. And I mean, that relationship didn't last. I'm sure that was part of it. And then, yeah, I had another partner in between who was very accepting of it, but not into it and wouldn't participate, where Peter and I will often do things around Wheel of the Year, festivals, and, we have tarot card art and we have astrological planetary stuff sort of all around the house, and some of it's his and some of it's mine. So even though the specifics are a little different, that interest and that sort of understanding from that esoteric perspective is definitely shared.
Yeah, that really helps then. And then Austin, your partner was already studying astrology before you guys met, because didn't I meet Caitlin before you
You
did?
did.
Okay.
Yeah, you met her
And
before
she
I
was like
did.
studying at Kepler College. So was that your first relationship with another astrologer?
No,
No.
I'd dated people before that were into astrology.
Okay. Was that
I was,
always,
when
had you ever not?
before I was into astrology, I went so hard into astrology and made it such a focal point of my life so early, and it still is, that if you're not really interested in astrology, I'm really boring to hang out with.
Right.
It's not that it's not that I won't make an effort to have non-astrological conversation with people, but it's been at the center of my life for not quite, but almost 20 years. And so, I think part of the way that worked is I wasn't very interested if you didn't think astrology was very interesting.
Right. I mean, isn't that ultimately the issue with like astrologer dating a non-astrologer, or in terms of tension, is it's not that the astrologer necessarily considers the non-astrologer uninteresting. It's almost like the reverse. It would look tremendously uninteresting, or like you're not doing something worthwhile if you're devoting all your time to astrology, if you didn't have any interest in it or any think it was a valid subject on some level.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that it's different when people have been together for a while and one of them gets bitten by the astrology bug.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And then, and that's a thing to adapt to rather than, sort of just present it at the very beginning and part of the dynamic from the very beginning. What I would say is that, with Kate and I both being students of astrology from before the beginning, it's helped in countless conversations and moments. Like, the more one understands themselves, the better a partner they are.
Mm-hmm.
The more you understand your partner, the better a partner you can be. And, and that's natal, but it's also transit. Like, oh, I'm mad about this. Oh, yeah, the moon is on my Mars by degree. Let me see how I feel in like 3 hours, or let me come back to this and see if, there's a similar level of heat, right? Or, and knowing your partner's transits, just simple moon stuff as well as the more sophisticated methods. Because people get into, I think people get into a mode where there's one thing that they're unhappy about, or that's happening at a particular time, or one thing that they, absolutely love. And then they tend to imagine that that's the whole relationship. Well, I can't possibly live with this if this is the way it's going to be. Whereas astrology shows you that, that both you and your partner are in very specific phases at any given moment, and that they're doing this part of their chart for, this day, this month, this decade, and that you're doing this other part of your chart.
Yeah.
The chart is big enough that it takes a whole life or more to unpack in its totality. And having a consistent reminder and timing tool for that keeps you from just focusing on this one thing and thinking that's all there is, which people get stuck in.
Yeah, it definitely provides a really great context or framework for understanding, and it can help with a little bit of compassion. And as you said, Austin,
Oh,
it
yeah.
can dial down some of the reactiveness as well.
Have you guys had drawbacks though, or issues where you found astrology was like not productive or was counterproductive in the relationship, or created unique problems, let's say, that you wouldn't have if you were two non-astrologers?
I don't think I don't think that's happened.
Kelly?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing for us will be that sometimes there'll be something going on where we're dealing with some drama or something together, not necessarily between us, but something we might be just dealing with because that's what we're dealing with at the time. And I'll sort of be like, oh, that's because this thing is doing that thing in my husband's chart, or that's because this is happening to me. And it's like, oh, okay, we've just got to get through it. But I sometimes forget to tell him that, and he'll be like getting a lot more stressed out about it. I'm like, oh, I've got to tell you that it's just this thing, and let's just give it a couple of days, and it's not going to be as rough as it seems right now. So, and that's just where each of us having a different connection to astrology comes in.
Okay. Well, that sounds pretty mild. I mean, you guys then have not had the joys of being in a relationship where you guys have completely different approaches to, let's say, house division or sign rulership, or like one of you is a Vedic astrologer and the other's like into Chinese astrology or something extreme like that.
No.
Those are some of the most hilarious relationship fights that you have ever experienced. And I feel a little bit bad if neither of you have never had to experience that.
Have you experienced that, Chris?
Yeah, I was in a relationship once where the other person, I was using whole sign houses, and one of the things she said was like, she really just hated whole sign houses passionately. And we had different languages, but one of the things she said was like, whole sign houses is the devil. is one of the things that she said at one point in like an argument. And this was not a healthy relationship, so I'm not going to play this off as if it was a great thing to begin with. But having astrologers having arguments about vastly differing approaches, like technical approaches, is not something that I've heard that's uncommon when it comes to astrologers sometimes dating. Because I've heard of like a traditional astrologer dating a modern astrologer, or somebody that does Vedic and sidereal dating like a tropical astrologer. Because normally you would think if you're both astrologers, you're both coming at it from the same perspective and you have some shared worldview that creates a connection between you, which is true to some extent. But in fact, if there's major technical differences between you, then it's like your actual worldviews and perceptions of yourself and each other sometimes come into conflict in like hilarious ways that you wouldn't anticipate until you're actually in that situation.
Yeah. I mean, I sort of can imagine, but I also can't because I haven't been in it. But I'm like, they would be almost, well, I'm like, would it be more difficult to be in a relationship with someone who was in astrology but had a totally different technical basis to you than someone who just wasn't in astrology at all?
Right. And that's actually a legitimate question, because you can get to that point given the relationship, depending on the relationship and depending on the, temperament of the people involved.
Yeah. Super interesting.
Anyway, good times. So that was one topic that we thought about touching on in the pre-show chat. Other topics, one of the things that came up is this article was being passed around about somebody in like Portland who was renting out a room and rejected a candidate because they were a Capricorn or something like that. And which is funny, and that's the actual reaction that a lot of the astrologers have, is just like, that's dumb and kind of funny. But it got picked up by The Guardian and a bunch of other news sites, like respectable news sites, as an instance of people using astrology to discriminate, or basically for discriminatory purposes. And that actually made me really nervous. And I had a stronger negative reaction to it, of feeling like we needed to call that out publicly as like not really being cool on some level, because I think it feeds into a false narrative that has become much more common over the past decade in skeptic circles, where they're trying to take this line of argumentation that astrology is inherently discriminatory, that it's not just false, but it's false and it's discriminatory because it leads people to make prejudices or prejudgments against people before they've met them, and therefore is evil in some way. And little things like this, even though it's like stupid and whatever, is kind of funny, but it may have a deeper underlying sort of societal issue if things like that start adding up and people start actually thinking that astrology is used for sort of prejudice.
Yeah, it's I almost feel like when you hear these things, it just shows the lack of understanding about the complexity of astrology. It reminds me of the question that sometimes I'll get from students, and sometimes even from clients who are newer to astrology, where they sort of want to know, like, what sign should I be looking for to date from a relationship perspective? And it's sort of like, I can understand where that question comes from, but it's the question itself is faulty because there's so much more to it. In the same way that I'm almost saying, well, Capricorn's pretty responsible. Like, they seem like the kind of, if you were just doing sun sign astrology, they seem like a flatmate that would be relatively tidy and maybe pay the rent on time. So I'm not actually sure why you would reject them, but they've obviously got some sort of understanding or bias. Maybe they dated a Capricorn they didn't like, so they just think all Capricorns are bad, and that frustrates me so much when people make those blanket statements.
Well, one thing that was a little weird is it may not have been just a purely sun sign oriented thing, because the actual like screenshot of the text message said something about this being like a mutable household where we're all mutable placements and we want the free flowing whatever nature that they were associating with that, and they didn't want some stern Capricorn coming in, and they said like doming the house or something like that. Yeah, so it might have actually been slightly more intermediate something astrology behind it. And I don't know if that actually makes it better or worse, because it still comes off as like saying that to a non-astrologer, like one of the things, it just comes off as kind of tasteless at the very least. I don't know. Why do you guys both laugh at it when you first hear about it? Like, what's your initial reaction when hearing this story, Austin?
Well,
Like, what is your response?
My initial response was laughter.
I'm just like every astrologer
I can analyze
I've met, that's
why
their
I thought it
initial
was
response.
funny. The analysis did not come before the reaction.
Yeah, and I'm not like attacking that or something. I'm just curious why every astrologer's response to it is laughing, and if we could articulate why that is for somebody that doesn't know.
Why
can we put it into words?
Why is that funny? I don't know. I don't have an explanation for that. Doesn't a clear explanation for that would be sensible to all does not come to mind.
Okay. What do you think, Kelly?
I mean, I think it's a simplistic view. To my mind, it seems like somebody's picked a random piece of information, like the sun is in Capricorn, and made a blanket judgment based on that. And to my mind, when you're looking for a flatmate, there's a bunch of other criteria, but they've just projected stuff about Capricorns onto this person. And this person is probably so much more than just that, and may have all sorts of other qualities and, that could make them a great flatmate. But they didn't, I think I also, like, you laugh, but also you feel a bit sad that people get blatantly rejected because of something that is important, but not the whole of who they are. And there's some discrimination there, maybe.
Sure. So then it leads to the broader question then of, is astrology inherently discriminatory, or is that like a misuse of astrology? And is that why it's funny? Because then we're just laughing at like, that's kind of a dumb use of astrology, because it's actually much more complicated than that. And just to reject somebody based on their sun sign or something like that is so...
Let me just say that the oversimplicity of it is part of the humor. Just like picking a sign, being like, yeah, fuck Geminis, right? I don't know. There's just something funny about that. It's silly.
Shakira in the chat saying that she says the person actually made a really long and thought out response and apology about that. That was an interesting read. I've been wondering if those people understood like what was they must have seen like all the media response to it. So I was curious if it was an actual astrologer or what. Could you share where that was? Because that's kind of interesting. I'd be curious to read that.
Well, so to get to the central point, right, which is is astrology discriminatory? If we take discrimination not in the illegal sense, but in the proper meaning of the term, does it allow a person to tell the difference between one thing and another, and then to choose between those things? Well, if it didn't do that, then there would be no point in studying it. The central supposition of electional astrology, for example, is that some times are more fortunate for some things. The central idea behind synastry, or the relationship between charts, is that some configurations between charts facilitate harmony and growth more effectively than others, right? And if we were to take this, no Capricorns need apply thing, and develop it to the point of, like full astrological technique. Let's say, it was like, oh, okay, I don't want somebody with a badly afflicted second and fourth house, because that's going to affect living situation, and also may speak negatively to their ability to do their part in domestic labor, as well as come up with the rent money and their part of the internet bill. And if that can be seen in a chart, then, and like, is that then discriminatory? Or, I mean, it is discriminating. It's choosing one person over another, but those are all astrological ways of addressing the criteria that would be immediately relevant to a living partner, right? So the question, I think the better phrasing of the question, or another way of look at it, would it be okay to do that if astrology's full tools were brought to bear in a way that was most likely quite accurate?
Right. I mean, so what you're bringing up then, or not what you're bringing up, but part of what I'm getting from what you're saying, or that brings me more to the crux of the underlying issue, is that astrology sometimes is used, and part of the purpose is partially to try to use it to infer what will happen in the future before an action has actually been taken, or to infer what kind of actions a person might take.
Yeah, or what
Um,
kind of patterns a person will tend to enact over time.
sure. But then the point still would be, or part of the crux, part of the issue would still be that if the person hasn't done that action yet, you're still making a sort of prejudgment ahead of time. And in some instances, you might be wrong, that the person might not end up taking that specific action given a certain scenario, or the things that you're taking as indicators, as potentialities, may not end up manifesting in that precise way. And in some ways, you can't fully know until you're in the actual scenario that you're talking about, right? I mean,
Um,
is every prediction that you've ever made, or every assumption you've ever made about a person based on their chart, always been correct?
well, no. And so but the question then is, so whenever a person is, say, choosing a roommate, the whole game is predicting the future as best you can and picking, right?
Right.
And so the goal is to discriminate between, of the people who apply, who will be the best roommate based on the tools that I have for seeing into their past in a way that would predict the future, as well as intuition about a person, little cues, et cetera, et cetera. Everybody who's interviewing roommates is already in that game. And so if you have a good track record with astrology, you might not talk about it, but you probably would do that. Would you not look at the chart of a potential roommate?
I mean, there's a couple of points here, like Austin. What you're offering, not necessarily what you're offering, but what you're sort of suggesting is a more nuanced and deep work of astrology. I think one of the reasons that I had sort of that funny reaction is just to make an assumption like that based off a sun sign placement is you don't even know what's going on with the second or the fourth or what have you. So it's maybe an inaccurate or ineffective or a superficial use of astrology, which I don't know. It annoys me, but I also sort of, you do see it all the time. And then I think absolutely there is the part of astrology is a tool to help you choose. And of course, you're going to want to choose the best for you in a situation. You can't always get a perfect solution though. So sometimes you are going to have to deal with a flatmate or a person that isn't ideal, doesn't have the best chart. And there can be some negotiation skills or some compromise skills, there can be some sort of learning or growth that happens by being in a situation that isn't as ideal as you might like it to be.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I understand your general point, and that's actually a good point, Austin. And it's what point Lisa had made as well, which is like astrology is one of many different like heuristic devices that people use in order to make assessments about things, especially if you're doing something like that, which is sort of like an interview about, do I want to live with this person, or have them in my home or what have you. I guess it's just there's some sort of balance there that's not well defined in the astrological community today, of like what's an okay application of astrology versus like when would things be going too far. So a lot of people, I haven't watched this yet, but a lot of people have been citing some television episode about like a sci-fi television show that apparently did something on this recently, where they had a show about like a whole society that used astrology as part of like creating different caste systems or different things like that. And the sort of like extreme scenario of what if society fully embraced it and used it to categorize people in ways that were maybe like overly restrictive or not healthy. And I guess that's part of the underlying question, as well as just at what point would it be like a misapplication, which would verge on something that we might more closely associate with prejudice or racism in a negative sense versus what is the constructive positive application of it. And I'm not
Well,
saying there's a good answer
I
to
mean,
that now,
one
but
very
just
simple answer to that is there should never be legislation that privileges or disadvantages people based on their charts. On a very simple level, like that should absolutely never happen.
so people by law at least should never be put into law. So then that raises the question then that was raised in the Guardian article, which is that technically something like this is not illegal right now, like filtering somebody based on their birth chart is not something that's covered by like anti-discrimination laws, but then should it be, or could it be at some point? Because then we get into the legal angle as well. Anyway, I'm not saying there's any good answers to this, but mainly just raising the discussion, since one of the feelings I have is this is not going to be the last time we see headlines stating astrology used for discriminatory purposes, and some newspapers and things like that, this saying, aha, like this confirms that astrology is primarily just a form of prejudice, and here's an example of it. Because I've seen this argument. It's a relatively new argument, but it's one that skeptics have been getting more loud about, I've noticed over the past decade or so. So that I think it's going to be like one of the sort of angles that they use in order to convince people that not just that astrology is wrong, but also that it's somehow evil in some way, which I don't personally believe, but I'm interested in how astrologers would respond to, and if they can provide a sufficient compelling response to accusations like that. All right. Well, that's all I've got on that topic. There's a lot of stuff coming in the chat. But so were there any other topics that we meant to touch on as pre-show stuff before we get into the forecast?
Let's see. Do we have anything else? Well, I don't think we have time for anything else anyway.
I mean, we're 45 minutes in. So
Yeah, I feel like we probably should get to the forecast itself just so we can take our time with that.
Take a leisurely stroll through the sun's time in Taurus.
Through the Taurus time.
And then we'll speed up at the end for Gemini.
We will have to go much faster, starting May 21st.
All right. So let's get into the forecast for the month of May then. Let me pull up the solar fire charts so that we can see the actual astrology for the month. Here we go. Can you guys see that?
We can now. Loud and clear.
Brilliant. So this is the chart set for May 1st, 2019, sometime in the afternoon here in Denver. It looks like we start out the month with Mars in Gemini, where it's going to spend a decent portion of the month before eventually moving into Cancer. The sun is, of course, moving through Taurus most of the month of May. Saturn has recently stationed retrograde in Capricorn, as has Pluto, and Jupiter is not long ago stationed retrograde in Sagittarius. So what are the highlights? Do we want to go by like chronologically or in terms of like the highlights for the month?
I'm easy. Do you have a preference?
Let's go chronologically.
Okay. Keep us on track.
Let's stroll.
Okay.
Take it all in.
So I see that Mercury starts off in Aries, but it's moving very fast at this point, and it's not going to spend super long in that sign. And it looks like we have a new moon that takes place just a few days into the month in Taurus, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
On
Saturday, May 4th.
May 4th. Okay. So new moon in Taurus at 14 degrees of Taurus. This is our first new moon, I think, since Uranus has moved into Taurus. So that's... Yeah, nice. Any other comments about this new moon?
For sure. Do you want to start, Austin?
Sure. I mean, like any new moon, which is the joining of the sun and moon in a particular sign and place, it recenters things. The new moon is the time to do that pivot between letting go of what you've been doing and picking back up picking up what you need to be ready for in the next cycle. It's an adjustment period. It's a transition period. It's an end beginning. And so here we're recentering in Taurus, right? And in the dead center of Taurus, which one might argue is the Taurusiest part of Taurus. And although, Mercury and Venus are in Aries, and, Venus being the ruler of Taurus, is of special importance. This gives us a little bit more fire, right? Than like a raw Taurus archetype. It's still, it's still that there's still a focus when you're dealing with Taurus with pacing and making sure that your recovery is equal to your efforts, right? Aries is sprinting, where you go as fast as you can and you worry about recovery later. But Taurus always comes after Aries, right? And you can't sprint through a whole season. And even though there's still a little bit of speed put on this first part of May with the planets in Aries and the Mars in Gemini, Taurus is the new moon in Taurus is certainly a reminder to check your pace and to make sure that you won't, that your leisure recovery has a thoughtful relationship to your exertion.
Yeah, that's really well put, Austin. And I had focused in as well, like the new moon in Taurus ruled by Venus in Aries. So there is some contrast or tension between the go slow, take your time, breathe it out Taurus versus Venus in Aries, which is quite fast paced. Although at the time of the new moon, Venus is moving into a square with Saturn in Capricorn. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was a really nice combination around this new moon prompting maybe fresh effort or renewed effort, Venus in Aries, towards a longer term project or goal as represented by the Saturn in Capricorn. And it may be that this new moon sort of marks the realization that an adjustment is required, because I always find a square aspect tends to indicate where there's some tension, where we can't quite keep going as we are. We need to tweak things, or we need to just refine either what we're doing or how we're going about what we're trying to achieve. And so it's not quite as simple, I think, as you were saying too, Austin. It's not just you can have the new moon in Taurus with Venus in Pisces or Venus in Virgo, and it's going to have a totally different tone. So there is still some activity, but I think that idea of measuring the effort, but also thinking about it more of a marathon rather than a sprint, which we get from the Taurus energy and Venus being an aspect to Saturn.
Yeah, I think the Venus-Saturn square is a really important point. That Venus-Saturn square may indicate that there is a need to do another little push, another little sprint, but against the background of pacing, right? Pacing. I need to sprint. I need to push a little bit more here, but that's not what I'm doing for the next several weeks. That's something I need to do, right? Mm-hmm. To finish up a lot of last month's stuff, or finish up things that were that still need just that little bit more to get across the finish line.
One of the things that's interesting about this, since this is the first new moon in Taurus since Uranus went into this sign, is sometimes you have the question about, so Uranus has gone into a new, for example, whole sign house for everybody in everybody's chart. And for some people, you'll start seeing changes in that house sooner. And for other people, it might be later, depending on if they have any fixed sign placements earlier in the sign or later in the sign that are going to get hit by Uranus exactly at some point. But for some people, with this new moon taking place, or this being the first new moon in this sign since Uranus is ingressed, I think we're going to start to see some new developments and some people sort of laying the seeds for some of the changes indicated by Uranus really starting to grow after this point, compared to what the past month or two that Uranus has been in that sign. So a new beginning, but specifically tied in with some of the disruptions and the detours indicated by Uranus now moving through that sign over the course of the next decade.
Yeah, and that's really doubled down on by what happens over the ensuing days, because not very long, I believe it's on Monday the 6th, Mercury moves into Taurus and spends the next several days in conjunction with Uranus, right? And so I think part of what you're going to see there is one, just the standard disruptions and revelations coming in on a mercurial level. Like, that's new thinking. It's also disruptive for communications, blah, 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 all that, all that standard stuff. But it's also bringing the mind, or bringing the intellective mind, to thinking about the Uranus and Taurus stuff that's already happened over the last month and a half, which is going to help bring to fruition some of those mutations which are planted but pending. And then the week afterwards, Venus will do the same and conjoin Uranus. So we have Mercury and Venus, in a sense, playing catch up with the sun and hitting Uranus, after the sun. And that'll continue to develop. Whatever those Uranian events, signatures, significations, mutations were planted by the new moon in Taurus.
Right. Yeah, I love that, because then eventually Venus ingresses and goes in there and conjoins Uranus as well around the time of the full moon in Scorpio later in the month.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting, because we always get this once a year where it's like the sun goes through Taurus and then Mercury goes through around the same time, and then Venus eventually catches up or goes through within a month or two of that as well. And it's just sort of a regular recurring thing. But we have this tonal shift now that's happening for the first time in any of our lifetimes, where we have this other like outer planet sitting in that sign, sort of disrupting the normal flow of that, or at least causing a tonal shift in what it's like for each of those planets to go through that sign in some sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Taurus is different territory for the next while.
And both of you are doing like consultations frequently still. Are you already seeing some of the shift come up in clients' charts with Uranus going through Taurus?
Yeah, I would say that is number 2 for the Uranus's shift, is the number 2 culprit for stuff worth talking about. The main thing is that South Node Saturn Pluto, that. It's just like, maybe 2/3 of the consultations I've done this year. That's what the client wants to talk about is anchored to Saturn South Node Pluto. But number 2, Uranus.
Okay. What have you seen, Kelly?
Yeah, definitely seeing those two themes come through for sure. And I'm just thinking, and then it's sort of the individual nuances about, what topics or what areas of life, but also what internal landscape the individual is meeting those transits with, depending on some of their progressed placements and cycles. So it is that they are the big themes transit-wise of the year: the South Node, Saturn, Pluto, Uranus into Taurus. I have had some clients this year who are dealing with the Neptune in Pisces piece. So for people who've got important chart factors, and maybe, that, I don't know where, I don't necessarily quite think about it in a numbered way as you have, Austin, but they are definitely the themes. I was joking with a student last week. They were sort of asking, how do you move through the ephemeris so quickly? And I sort of was just saying, because I'm in it every day, and then because this Saturn station, I'm like, I've got the dates of Saturn at 20 degrees Capricorn memorized, because I've been repeating them in client sessions for the last sort of 6 to 9 months to clients who have, planets or angle points, chart factors around that 20 degrees of any of the cardinal signs. It's like, okay, we're doing the Saturn dance, and these are the dates, and this is the territory.
Right. And you mentioned the ephemeris, which is funny because that was the other story that we forgot, that we skipped over at least. But now that makes me realize that story must have been like particularly triggering for you, Kelly. And the question of whether like familiarity, let's say, with an ephemeris is a necessary prerequisite to be an astrologer is the broader question.
I mean, one thought I had once we started recording live, clearly our ongoing discussions on the podcast about how important this book is and why everyone should have one, we're just not saying that often enough or loud enough. That's what I've taken from this, is that I need to say that more.
I like that. Yeah, yeah. Or maybe not everyone listens to the podcast. I don't know.
I mean, that is a possibility.
So, and I don't want to keep like having to play devil's advocate, but for the sake of playing devil's advocate, I wanted to say that what if we're in a period where we're not in the same way that over the past 2 decades, we've moved into a period where knowing how to calculate a chart by hand, for example, is not a necessary prerequisite to be or to call yourself an astrologer? Have we actually reached a point where even knowledge of an ephemeris, while useful and something that we love clearly, and think is like a very useful tool, maybe it's not necessarily a prerequisite in this day and age where everybody is just calculating charts, on websites or with apps or what have you?
Well, so I think that's a great question. And I think that what is important is that you should know what the planets are doing and what they plan on doing. And an ephemerides is, or an ephemeris is a way of knowing that. You should have knowledge, right? Like Planet Watcher gives a person knowledge of where the planets are. It's a digital visual ephemeris, but it's an ephemeris. And I would prefer people know that word, but if I have to choose, I would definitely prefer they have the knowledge of what the planets are doing and what they're going to do. And whatever particular tool they are using to obtain that knowledge is way less important to me than if they have that knowledge, because that's what we need as astrologers.
Right. I mean, because Solar Fire, for example, or Astro.com is an ephemeris, and it's based on the Swiss ephemeris. It shows planetary positions, and you can look up where they were in the past and where they will be in the future. So then, are we at a stage then where that's sufficient because you're basically using a computerized ephemeris that shows it to you in segments or that you can animate versus just having it in book form? I mean,
I'm okay with
think
that. I don't think that a list is superior to an animatable, clickable visual display. The visual display, a visual display like Planet Watcher, or like you can animate a chart in Solar Fire, lets you see everything at once and lets you see rates of relative movement. I would say that is when possible, when you have that, that's a tool that gives you more information. It's a superior form of arranging the information, but you don't always have that, handy. And so having it in book form is super handy too.
Sure.
Yeah, that's a beautiful point, Austin. And I agree with you. I think as long as people understand the way the planet cycle works, that it can be at 1 degree today and it can be back there again 3 months later or 6 months later, that's really critical. And if you have access to software that is going to animate that for you, and you've got the patience and you take the time to go through it day by day or week by week, depending on which planet you're looking at, you will get the same information for sure. Yeah.
Do you want to defend, though, the pro ephemeris position, Kelly?
I know that my preference for a book ephemeris is partly a personal thing, in that I'm a massive paper person and I like to feel something in my hand. I like to use a pen on a piece of paper. And so that's how I like to learn. I do like a little bit of the hands-on manual. From a teaching perspective, I have found that students who take the time to work through the paper ephemeris, they can sort of plot or follow the planet's pathway in a way that's, there's a clarity to it. But I also know that some learners are much more visual and they would definitely prefer to see the diagram wheel, or even to see, those transit map grid things. But look, I mean, I think I'm on my third version of the 21st century ephemeris right now. So I do, but I completely acknowledge it's my personal preference. But I do recommend it. I think there's a lot you can get from it. And when I teach progressions, it's a really great tool. And I encourage students, whether they buy the book or, you don't have to spend money on it, because the Swiss ephemeris is available free online. You can just Google Swiss ephemeris and the year that you need. whether it's 2019, 2020, and you can just print off 6 sheets and have your ephemeris. So the information is definitely there. But yeah, I mean, I do favor the paper, but I acknowledge that that's partly personal preference.
Sure, sure. I mean, there's something about being able to like open a book and see 100 years at a glance of planetary movements that's kind of useful. Not a requirement, but it's certainly a different perspective on the planetary movements and maybe gives you more insight into them than you might have otherwise. But yeah.
Well, I'll throw a point out for defending the paper ephemeris. If you're going to bill yourself as a professional astrologer, and the implication is that you are an expert, it's not just that you know something about astrology. Many people know something. Then, knowing what a printed ephemeris is and being able to use it if that is where the information is available and not other places, that is, I would set that as a bare minimum requirement. That's a very low bar.
It is a low bar, that's true. I guess when the story came up, and I don't want to get too much into the story itself, part of me felt a little defensive over the person because I wasn't sure if we'd entered an era where maybe that's not, in the same way that knowing what a table of houses is not a requirement for being an astrologer. Knowing how to calculate a chart is not a requirement for being an astrologer at this point. Like astronomically, literally knowing the astronomy underlying what you're doing, because astrology is primarily an interpretive art, and our primary litmus test for an astrologer is, can they interpret a chart effectively? I think I think we would all agree maybe above anything else, right?
Mm-hmm.
Would we say?
I would agree with that, Kelly.
Absolutely. Yeah. You have to interpret. I mean, when I'm teaching my students, I always say the process to get to a chart interpretation, you first have to gather some data. You have to gather, what is in the birth chart, this planetary placement or this aspect or this planetary condition. Then you have to kind of synthesize or order the data. In the context of this chart, it's a night chart. The stuff going on with the moon is more important than maybe the stuff going on with the sun, although maybe so you have to, you do have to do a little bit of data management before you get to the interpretive piece. The bulk of our work as astrologers is interpretation. That's where we do the heavy lifting. We translate the language of the sky into something accessible for people who may not be studied in this form. So it is interpretive, but to do good interpretations, you have to do some good data wrangling beforehand, I guess.
Sure. I guess the question is just at this point, what's the bare minimum in terms of data wrangling that you should be able to do beyond? Because that was one of the debates I saw some of the older astrologers having over the past 20 years, especially like 20 years ago or 10 years ago. Like in Holden's book, he has this offhand comment where he talks about how most astrologers have just become like advanced computer users at this point, because all you need to know to calculate a chart is just how to enter the birth data, and then it calculates it for you, and you don't need to know the underlying astronomy behind the chart. But it just raises a really interesting issue, and that's something that I think about that comes up in instances like this, is just the broader debate that's like this eternal debate within the astrological community, which is what are the criteria for being able to call yourself an astrologer? And because of the lack of standardized testing or certification in the field, that's been a debate for like decades at this point, because there's no clear answer to that question necessarily.
Well, we can all give our own answers, but the thing is everyone defines that for themselves. I guess it's a self-defined or self-regulated thing.
Yeah, that's a better way of putting it. Sorry, I didn't mean to say that there's no answer, but many people have different answers and define that in different ways to themselves. Some people, for example, say you have to have certification from a organization or from a school, for example. Do any of you guys did you get certification?
Yeah.
Nope.
I ticked all the boxes.
What did you get?
I'm certified by the FAA in Australia. I
Okay.
even calculated charts by hand, but that's also partly my age, because I didn't have a computer when I first started studying astrology. So, and partly that's my age, but also the fact that I'm a tech idiot. And I'm just not, I would not have been an early adopter. Computers existed, but I wouldn't have had one.
Okay.
And yeah, so yeah, I have the FAA practitioner level certification. It's comparable. I mean, I don't want to compare it actually to the training standards offered in America. There are 3 very comprehensive essays, and then there is a mathematics calculation exam that you have to pass.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably comparable to like the NCGR certification or something.
Yeah. And do you guys have any certification or more like self-taught, which
So
I know many people are?
I was, so I said nope, but then I guess I do have, I did get some certification through Freedom Cole's class for, as far as that particular lineage in school goes, being officially a geotishi. So I guess I do have that. I didn't really think about that, but no, and that was just sort of, a nice side effect of me studying things, in a more formal context. But no, I didn't go through a certification program. It was self-study, and then Project Hindsight material had a huge impact on me, and but I haven't gone through a program. And I also think if when we're talking about certification, there's everybody who teaches, if they're not just doing classes like, yeah, I'll teach you how to do perfections, or yeah, I'll teach you, let's talk about synodic cycles or whatever it is. If there's a teaching program that offers a stamp of approval at the end, then there are always standards, or one, good Lord, I hope there are always standards, right? If you were, so Kelly, if you were asked whether you would publicly rubber stamp, or maybe like signet ring stamp, cooler stamp, someone is like, this person is ready to be a professional, like you would be like, okay, well, they definitely need to know this, and this. I would feel the same. I'm sure Chris would feel the same. And I think certification is interesting because it ties into questions of lineage, right? Because a good lineage always has certification, and that's why it's useful to study with somebody who's, let's say, 4 generations down, because there's been a quality control, and it wasn't just like 4 generations of people that kind of knew each other, right? You're assuming that grandma, great grandma in that tradition made sure that grandma knew her shit, and the grandma made sure mom knew her shit, and then mom made sure you knew your shit, And so there is the institutional certification issue in question, but then there's also that within lineages. And can I have y'all's permission to go on a 2-minute rant from here? I know I've been talking. I've got a rant. I've got
as long as, just keep in mind that we have 45 minutes left before we're at 2 hours. We're at 1 hour and 15 right now.
Okay. Yeah.
I'd love to hear your rant, Austin, as long as, yeah.
Okay. And it's a relevant rant. It's not about how I hated the tacos I got the other day. So, although they were decidedly mediocre. So I've just been thinking a lot about lineage. I was doing a reading for a client the other day. And I'll use my Hellenistic and my modern and my Vedic in readings. I use all my tools. Some conversations are, all one, all the other. But and I just mentioned something about, well, and in the tradition of Vedic that I've been studying, and I can't speak for everything that's happened on that subcontinent, we do this. And he was just like, man, lineage sure is nice, like being able to learn from people rather than having to start from scratch. He's like, oh, I wish we had that with some of these Western traditions. And I was like, yeah, that would be nice. But one part of my Jupiterian reflex on that was that with this, volcanic eruption / recovery of all these core texts and the entire history of the astrology that went west from Alexandria, where I feel like we're in an era where people will look back and see a number of lineages beginning now. Like there are people who are teaching and studying now who will pass on, and their students will pass on. And in 150 years, people look back at this time as when lineages began, and that's both exciting and I think a more positive way to look at we don't have any of that and it sucks. And so that's my point.
Yeah, it's a nexus where a bunch of the older lineages are being restarted again and then reconnected with a lot of the living modern lineages. Because actually, I mean, to be honest, though, the modern lineages exist. Like if you look at any,
And that's fair.
modern astrologer who's alive and practicing today, they have both books as well as often like teachers that they learned from. And even if they didn't take a lot from that person or that singular book, even if they didn't emulate that system completely, they were still influenced by it in some way.
Yeah, well, and let me clarify. This conversation arose when we were talking about traditional Western and Hellenistic. And so, we don't have we don't have like 3 generations of practitioners who've been zodiacal releasing for all the 20th century. We don't have any grandparents to learn from with that. That's been okay. So Valens says this, let's all experiment and compare findings.
Or another one that's interesting is the horary lineage that was the traditional horary lineage that was revived in the UK in the 1980s because there was an original core group of that was like Olivia Barclay pushes to get Lily reprinted in the mid-1980s. It's reprinted and she starts teaching the qualifying horary practitioners course or whatever it's called, the QHP. And she has a number of students, and like that first generation of students included like John Frawley,
Yes.
Deborah Holding,
Yes.
Lee Lehman, and like one or two, actually several others, but those are just like, let's say 3 examples. And then, for example, from those, you have sort of students like Lee taught, for example, what's his name? Kevin Burke. So Kevin Burke would then represent another generation that came after, 3rd generation. And then Kevin Burke has gone on to have students. Or you have, Deb Holding, and she's taught students like, or no, actually backing up, Christopher Warnock was a student of Lee Lehman. So he's like a 3rd generation. Then he's gone on to teach other students and so on and so forth. So even in the recent traditional revival, which is relatively sudden, we're already seeing like 2nd and 3rd and 4th generation students coming out of that in terms of those specific lineages.
Yeah, and that's again, it's starting up again. And one thing I will say though, and this is not an insult to any of the people mentioned or in parallel situations, but there has been, while this stuff has been passing, huge new material translated. The beginning point wasn't a full astrology where there was like a full traditional natal, a full traditional horary, a full traditional electional, a full traditional magic, and there was a whole system, and that was passed on. It was like, let's do, like extracting horary from Lily and then passing that on. But then, for a lot of the people that you mentioned, they found or added something completely new that wasn't part of the lineage. And so part of what I'm thinking, part of what makes something solid in its passing through the years is that it's relatively complete. And that has not been possible until very recently.
Yeah,
and so that just a a side point.
Definitely. All right.
These are wonderful side points. I can't remember where we were in the month of May.
I know. Yep. This is really tough because I love you guys. I love talking about just our random astrological conference.
We've got to hold it for late night chats at NORWAC.
Here's the transition. And Taurus is the fixed earth sign. And so therefore has always speaks to what endures over time, and it's Venus ruled. And so we're talking about what is a value that's passed down and maintained over time. And so we were just giving you a very extended and detailed example of how Taurian dynamics works. Stuff's in Taurus this month. Think about it.
I love it.
Nice segue.
All right. New moon in Taurus. We have covered that. Mercury goes into Taurus May 6th. I'm not seeing anything else. The moon keeps moving through. Mars opposes Jupiter at one point around May 6th, it looks like. So Jupiter is getting that opposition from 23 Sag from Mars at 23 Gemini.
Yeah, what do you guys think about that?
I think Jupiter is kind of, it's been so well placed since it moved into Sagittarius, but now we're starting to run into some problems and see some of whatever the drawbacks are of Jupiter in Sagittarius now that it's not only stationed retrograde, but it's getting that strong opposition from Mars at the same time. This is kind of like the not worst case scenario for Jupiter, but certainly it's not all like, running through fields of roses at this point.
Yeah, I think this one is, the Mars-Jupiter opposition. Bad for Jupiter, good for Mars.
Yeah.
Right.
Jupiter's balloon gets a bit popped, but Mars gets amplified in some way or encouraged. I always think about when I see an opposition like this to Jupiter with, high energy Mars and obviously over the top Jupiter, it makes me think of an elastic band, which is just getting stretched and stretched and stretched. And that idea of going over the top, doing too much, being pulled in different directions at the same time. There's obviously some tension here because it is an opposition. So I think particularly if the mutable signs are strong in your chart, or those degrees, 23 Gemini, 23 Sag are strong in your chart, there is definitely a little bit of volatility here. I think it's workable, or, not that it definitely has to have a positive outcome. Something has to cut or pop here. The elastic kind of goes too far, I think, at this point.
I think it's totally workable. So here's a good and a bad from my perspective for Mars Jupiter opposition where it is. Good, it can be super. You can have that martial fire backed by Jupiterian enthusiasm, right? Like just getting a lot done, keeping high spirits as you overcome, little challenges, this and that. The negative side of the combination of Mars and Jupiter, is the crusader, right? Is the adding the priestly authority to the martial destructiveness, and getting up on your high horse, right? There's definitely some high horse possibilities there, with Sagittarius, the twins riding the high horse, right?
Good imagery.
But, if that's direct, and this is just, as a general rule with Mars, it's always better if it's not social. Direct Mars to accomplishing tasks, not accomplishing people.
Yeah, I mean, as you were saying that, Austin, I'm like, this would be really good for someone who had a big writing project or a big research project, something where you could, thinking specifically about a project for Mars in Gemini, something to do with words or ideas that was a little bit self-contained or solo.
Yeah, exactly. And Jupiter can be used as an asset to Mars in this case, and will help uplift Mars a little bit. For the purely Jupiterian peace and justice work, it's a real impediment.
There is a little bit of sort of disagreement that comes out of this aspect, I think, or a quality of disagreement or discord.
Yeah, and it doesn't help that Venus is tightly square Saturn while this aspect climaxes, which is also not good for social accord, and for moods in general.
Yeah.
Yeah, like what happens when the proselytizing of Jupiter in Sagittarius runs into heavy opposition from a disagreeing party, or a party that's naturally running at cross purposes to that.
Yeah. Well, and just everybody's in a bad mood, generally speaking, right? And you have that.
And Brittany Ostland in the chat notes that the moon crosses 26 Taurus at pretty much almost the same time as the aspect.
Yeah. So a little kaput algol action. Don't lose your head.
Don't lose your head. Yeah, I mean, I do find watching planets going over Algol is just a good clue for when there's a heightened energy about stress or anxiety or even inner mental anguish. So just,
Well, on that note, one thing I find that's really interesting, or one thing that I find really interesting about watching planets go over fixed stars in contrast to planets aspect each other, is when planets make tight and strong aspects to each other, it's always there. Whereas one thing I find with fixed stars is if you go in the direction that fixed star indicates, like if you go towards the, freaking out direction that Algol indicates, Algol will take you all the way home. But if you don't take a step in that direction, I don't see or feel a pull towards it. The fixed stars seem to be very on and off depending on whether you're moving with them or not. Whereas I see the planets the planets aspects to the planets as having a much more consistent gravity.
Definitely. All right. So let's keep zooming through here. So that's the Mars Jupiter opposition.
Yeah.
Oh, Kelly?
I was just going to say, I'm really excited to get to May 15 with the mid-month mood shift.
Yeah. So pretty much at the same time, as was mentioned, Venus has to square South Node Saturn Pluto, which is, which is hard on the heart. It's dealing with Venus, you're dealing with some of the relational consequences of whatever that South Node Saturn Pluto thing is doing. Generally not uplifting, but also very temporary.
Do you guys have a few keywords for Pluto that you come back to, just like, not to keep bringing us back to other far afield topics, but the previous episode that I did before this one was Kenneth Miller talking about the history of Pluto and how astrologers didn't seem to be on the same page about it for decades after its discovery, and then suddenly were, but some issues surrounding that where they seem to be drawing in like Scorpio and 8th house significations for Pluto. And the question of, is our understanding and definition of Pluto as clear as it is for Uranus and Neptune, for example?
I don't think Pluto is as, I see, so this is a big question.
Right. I'm just like throwing that out there.
Yeah, I love that. This is very Pluto of you, Chris.
Yeah, right. My keyword for Pluto is Chris Brennan. Let's see. So I see Pluto as a modifier to the rest of the planets rather than as a planet in and of itself. It is the access point. It is the one member of the Kuiper belt and that whole layer of the solar system that crosses in to our little system. And so it's that gateway or access point to the outer darkness in which the soul and other things dwell. I see a lot of gateways with Pluto, stumbling into a world you didn't know existed, a secret world, which may be secret because it's bad, or it may be hidden for other reasons. In the psyche, that's, all of the layers that get kind of conflated into the subconscious or the unconscious. Pluto can also be, accessing a criminal underworld. It can be, the halls of power. It's access, it's things coming out of that secret world into your sunny realm, or traveling from your sunny realm into whatever little pocket dimension. Power and secrecy are certainly themes, and I think it's I think the underworld symbolism is smack on the nose over and over and over again.
All right, that was really good, but I do regret now already taking us on this digression.
We can just stick with Chris Brennan as the keyword.
Yeah.
I want to ask you if you have any keywords, Kelly, but we can either do that or we can move on. What do you want?
I can be very brief. I mean, Austin, you made a beautiful point. Yeah. I like that you almost link the underworld to otherworld, because I think, and I like the idea of Pluto as a gateway, because it does take you into a place, either internally or into a set of circumstances that is going to be darker and more confronting and demand more from you. So very simple keywords, obsession, investigation, intense. There's a depth. There is an introspective quality to Pluto. But I also like and I often see with clients triggers to do with extreme wealth or power or persuasiveness coming up with Pluto, but also, themes around trust and loyalty and betrayal. And I appreciate a lot of those words do cross over with maybe the Scorpio or the 8th house pattern, but they do seem relevant to Pluto too.
Yeah, I agree with every single one of those. That's
definitely.
what I see when I look at Pluto, Pluto stuff in a person's chart by transit or natally.
Yeah.
I always
So there you
liked,
go, Chris. We did it quickly.
thank you. That was really good. I always liked Alan White. He had this statement that Pluto it takes small things and makes them really big, and it takes big things and makes them really small. And because that's, to me, as an archetype, that statement covers a lot of the things like that you see when you get like a Venus Pluto aspect, and you see somebody getting really intensely like obsessed with a relationship and taking something very small and blowing it out of all proportion, or a Mercury Pluto aspect and this sort of intensity with which they can take something mercurial and blow it into something very large.
That's a beautiful point.
All right, let's get back to the forecast. So you guys were saying basically that we have those few ingresses and we have the new moon at the beginning of the month, but then the big shifts don't take place until about the middle of May, right?
Well, Mercury's ingress into Taurus is important,
Yeah. I mean, we touched on that
right?
briefly.
So we've got that, like that. Basically, that second week of the month is pretty stocked, right? We've got Mercury ingressing into Taurus, spending that time conjunct Uranus, while Jupiter and Mars make their opposition, and Venus squares the the Saturn Pluto South Node meat grinder component. And then we're in the middle of the month.
Okay, there we go. So mid-month, and Venus ingresses into Taurus on May 15th. Right around the same time, we get Mars departing from Gemini and moving into Cancer by the 16th, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on where you are, I mean, Eastern time zone, they both happen on the 15th, but 15th, 16th, depending on where you are.
Okay.
Yeah. It just strikes me as a real change in tone going from Venus and Mars in an air and a fire sign into an earth and water sign. So there's a slowing down or a deepening or a softening with Mars, but that's not always a good thing with Mars. And it also makes me realize too that because we have no Mars retrograde this year, every 6 weeks we get a different focus from Mars, and we are shifting in the middle of May for the first time since the end of February, early March. We've now got a different Mars to guide us. And I mean, Austin has given us a very poetic, now world famous name for what this 6-week period is going to be. But it's different. I mean, it will be less frantic in that scattered, excessive mental quality of Mars in Gemini, but it will have its own challenges for sure.
Yeah, and Mars movement into Cancer puts it opposite by sign, South Node, Saturn, Pluto in the same sign as the North Node, but that doesn't really get exciting for a while. There are 20 degrees between them on the 16th. And so we really see the Mars firing all those dynamics up in June primarily. We'll see some. I think we'll see. We'll see some sizzle reels of some trailers, some action, some emotively packed trailers of what those dynamics might be. But that doesn't really get moving until later. It's not just on the ingress and it's go time.
Yeah, I mean, this is certainly the buildup starts at that point. Like, this is the buildup for the summer fireworks and sort of some of the clashes that we were anticipating with especially the Mars Saturn and Mars Pluto oppositions.
Yeah,
later
July.
June.
Yeah, our June-July parade.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, Mars in Cancer has much more of a moody quality. And I always find Mars in a water sign, maybe not every water sign, but I mean, maybe just Mars in Cancer. There is that idea of mood affecting motivation.
Mm-hmm.
So, there is going to be maybe more of a fluctuation around when you feel inspired and you get things done versus feeling more if you get a bit hurt or you feel a bit flat and then just not, being harder to motivate yourself with Mars in Cancer. And there's a protective quality here with Mars in Cancer too that is less inclined to extend outwards and more inclined, unless maybe it's going on the attack, I guess. So there could be a little bit of an internal sort of broody or reflective tone, I think. It's just such a big change with Venus and Mars both going from, hot expressive signs to cool, dare I say, introspective signs, that the second half of the month feels quite different, especially in this sort of 7-day period before the sun changes signs.
Yeah, it's definitely a shift.
Because one of the contrasts is we're going from a long period of like a month or two where Mars, the primary thing it was running into was that opposition with Jupiter, but Jupiter's not stopping anything Mars is trying to do. If anything, the problem with that opposition is Jupiter's just exacerbating what Mars wants to do in the first place and giving him free run to do whatever he wants and making him much bigger in doing whatever he wants. Whereas here, once Mars goes into Cancer, it starts to build up to that opposition with Saturn and the sort of gridlock that you run into with a Mars-Saturn opposition where you have opposing forces of like, fire and cold that are literally just running headlong into each other.
Yeah, and that, of course, exacerbated by the nodes, right? The nodes complicate the territory. One of the simplest things you could say is that the nodes make clarity difficult, because the very reason we calculate nodes and what they show are when eclipses happen. And eclipses are events of shadow. And shadow means not being able to see something because it's in the shadows. And so, the visibility around the nodes is always much trickier. And so, to a certain degree, it's like, the last thing we need is a lack of clear visibility when we're already trying to do a Mars-Saturn opposition well. But that Venus in Taurus is a saving grace to a certain degree, especially once it clears Uranus. It's interesting that the conjunction with Uranus is really interesting and should pop off. It should pop off Uranian events more than any of the other previous conjunctions, because Uranus in Taurus is in a Venus-ruled sign. Yeah. And so it's conjoining its ruler, maximum amount of ability to just make stuff happen. But then after Uranus and Venus do their thing, and Venus is just in Taurus for another 20-some degrees, then we have the sort of classical Venus in Taurus as a stabilizing, luxury, enabling, factor, which helps mellow down the ambient strife from whatever Mars early in and coming up on opposition with Saturn creates.
Right. And notice right after Venus starts separating from that conjunction with Uranus, we get the full moon in Scorpio on May 18th, it looks like. So there's like a culmination of events in Scorpio happening. And then just a few days after that, we get the nearly simultaneous ingress of the Sun and Mercury into Gemini, where they conjoin, and we have the Mercury Cazimi at 0 degrees of Gemini on May 21st.
Yes, I just remembered something. On the full moon weekend, so as you were saying that, Chris, I was like, that's the big weekend in May, the May 18th, 19th, which is the Scorpio full moon and the Venus conjunct Uranus aspect. Right. I'll actually be teaching in New York that weekend. I'm doing a progressions workshop for the NCGR community there, which I forgot to mention earlier, because I keep thinking, that's right, the Scorpio full moon is in my 9th house. I'm going to be traveling to another country to teach. And like no-brainer basic timing astrology. But then the energy shifts, once we get to the 21st, and the Sun and Mercury almost like hold hands as they cross into Gemini. And that's a totally different quality of influences. I mean, we go from the depths of Scorpio and then straight up to Gemini.
Yeah, I really love that Sun-Mercury conjunction in Gemini, and that period with like Mercury in Gemini and then Venus in Taurus actually opens up a great period Lisa and I just recorded the auspicious elections episode for this coming month yesterday and saw that like all of the great electional charts are taking place towards the end of May because you can really take advantage of Mercury being in Gemini and Venus being in her home sign of Taurus during the course of the latter part of the month.
Yeah, I really wish Mercury wasn't combust for as long as it is in Gemini. It being its own sign saves some of that, but it's still not a visible Mercury. It's, and that's not that's not saying that it can't anchor some good elections. That was just, I found myself when looking at elections for that period, just wishing, we get a few more degrees away from the sun, buddy. Can we have that too?
Oh, yeah. It's always the picking and choosing, right?
Yep. But yeah, those are the best things in the sky. Absolutely. That's what there is to build around.
Yeah. Did you have an electional chart to share, Chris?
Yeah, I might as well just throw it out now while we're talking about it. So a few days later, actually, one of the charts that we highlighted as the best chart, one of the best charts for the month of May for electional purposes is on May 25th basically around 6 o'clock in the morning, just after sunrise. So make it so that in your city, whatever your city is, just make it so that the ascendant is in Gemini, probably around 8 degrees. And you'll end up with a chart on this date that has Mercury conjunct the ascendant at 8 degrees of Gemini, the sun also in Gemini, just a few degrees above the ascendant, making it a day chart. And then the moon on this date is in Aquarius, and it's, depending on your time zone, basically in Denver and all time zones east of that, you'll be able to get the moon still applying to a sextile with Jupiter, with the moon being at 21 Aquarius in the ninth whole sign house, applying to a sextile with Jupiter at 21 Sagittarius in the seventh whole sign house. If you're west of Denver, you may not be able to get that, but if you back this election up a day and just do May 24th, you can still get the moon applying to Jupiter. So this is a great Mercury election because it basically has Mercury ruling the ascendant in the first house, in its home sign in Gemini. It's true that it is under the beams because it's proximity to the sun, but because it's in its own domicile, that acts as a mitigating condition. Mars is no longer in Gemini, which is nice. It's moved over into Cancer, so it's no longer in the same sign as Mercury. Mercury has that opposition from Jupiter, which is helpful, and it's not quite moved too close to the square with Neptune yet, even though that is still forming. Let's see. It's not a good chart for financial matters because it places Mars in the second house in a day chart, but it is great for all other Mercury-related activities like writing, speaking, communications, and other things like that. So it's also not a bad chart for seventh house matters with Jupiter in the seventh in a day chart in Sagittarius.
Mm-hmm. 10th house doesn't look too bad either. You've got angular Jupiter in Sag ruling the 10th.
Yeah. So it's kind of not a bad chart for partnership related things. In Denver, I think we picked the specific times that we could make the midheaven kind of roughly configured to Venus within 3 degrees to kind of mitigate its 12th house position, because that's the only planet that otherwise we would like to be in better shape, but isn't in the 12th there. But if you can just get the degree of an angle to be aspecting Venus within 3 degrees, then you can kind of bring Venus out of its 12th house position a little bit. And so that is and this is actually taking place, I think, around the time of Norwalk, right?
I was just thinking, so whoever's up early on Saturday morning at Norwalk can use this chart, or if anyone still happens to be up from the night before.
Yeah.
That will not be me, but I don't think I'll be either up early or still up. I'll probably be asleep.
Definitely. And I've used elections like this before to start like writing projects, like for a paper or a book or even like a blog post or something like that, because Mercury and Gemini is just really well suited for something like that. All right, so that's the election for this month. We've got 5 other elections that we found for May of 2019, which are in the Auspicious Elections podcast, which is available to patrons who sign up for our page on Patreon, which you can find out more information about at theastrologypodcast.com/subscribe. All right, so that's the election for the month. That brings us back. So we're in the lighter part of Mercury, and we are in the later part of this episode. So what's some of the stuff that's happening in the last part of the month that we need to hit?
We might as well just give people a heads up about the Moon in Capricorn period, just because that I think every month we should be paying attention, or people may already be paying attention to the Moon in Capricorn being especially melancholy because of the Saturn South Node Pluto pileup.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean,
with all of that having stationed recently.
Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying, especially with all of that having stationed retrograde there recently.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so even though we don't get a climax of whatever the Mars Saturn thing is for a while, we do have Mars and Saturn are both cardinal now. And so that means that whenever we're looking at the moon's passes through cardinal signs, we're going to be making, oppositions or hard aspects to all of the malefics at once, which is kind of good for the benefics, right? If we're looking at fixed signs, the only things to aspect are Uranus and Venus. If we're looking at mutable signs, right, there's nobody who's particularly ornery, but it's, it begins a challenging period for cardinal signs and cardinal, the transiting cardinal moon. And most especially for Cancer and Capricorn.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful point. And because really we will get the moon opposite Mars here early in Capricorn, and then the moon slides straight into the conjunctions. So that's a really great point, Austin. I think just keeping your wits about you on these cardinal moon sign days.
Yeah. Well, and just to jump back to what you said about the melancholy of of the moon hitting Saturn, Pluto, South Node. I actually had a friend just email me or private message me a little while ago. It was like, oh, wow, the melancholy from the moon's movement through Capricorn is real, huh? And yeah, that, Saturn's melancholic. Whereas Mars, so Saturn on an emotional level, as far as emotional primary colors, in terms of negative emotions, Saturn is sadness or depression. And then Mars is anger, right? And so that's part of why it can be difficult when Mars and Saturn are together, because it's being both angry and sad. It's one thing to be angry, right? Like you can, take some deep breaths or whatever, but when you're angry, or just be sad, but angry and sad at the same time is harder. That's like everybody's least favorite mix up. Or, mashup, as it were. I was trying to think in terms of frozen yogurt flavors being combined, but it didn't come together. But that's where my mind went.
I don't even know what a
really
Saturn
awful
flavor
frozen
would be.
Yogurt. What?
What would a Saturn flavor be?
Well, I don't know what frozen yogurt tastes like sadness.
But
like
Saturn
charcoal.
Charcoal?
Yeah.
It would be so bland.
Charcoal and gasoline? I don't know.
I don't know. But I mean, God, that's hilarious.
We don't have to follow this frozen yogurt metaphor.
No, I just got very curious. I'm like, but I can usually, Mars, you can pick chili or something with heat as a flavor. But I was like, what flavor? I was genuinely like, I don't know what flavors would be Saturn. We're going to have people write in and let us know their sadness flavors.
Yeah, bitter, sometimes cold, not like cool like yogurt cold, but astringent. Yeah,
I was thinking,
thank you, Jack Marsh.
Jack read my mind. I'm like, astringent. Yeah, astringent, bitter. So you can't really have ice cream because you'd have to have it without the sugar.
So maybe, I don't know, could we do like star anise and no, I don't know. Anyway.
Oh, coffee. Good call,
no, coffee's, if this serves me coffee, I will be delighted.
Coffee, I mean, it's an impact in that it energizes would be a Mars thing, but the taste of coffee is quite bitter.
And it's drying.
It is drying, so that works with Saturn.
Actually, that works with both. They both dry.
Yeah. So, yeah, and because I did notice the Moon in Capricorn period at the end of April, more so than I normally do. And of course, I was reminding myself that Saturn had just stationed retrograde. And so I think that melancholy quality is further enhanced by the retrograde of Saturn. And then, as you said, Austin, we're now not just sad and flat, but we're also going to be angry since we have Mars in Cancer from the middle of May until early July. Yeah.
And, it's important to notice that anger isn't always full-blown rage, right? Like irritability, being irritated is basically just like level 1 anger.
Yeah.
You're like, And, you know, when you're like, things aren't going that well and they did that and it's super irritating, right? It's that, you know, that combination that makes those two challenging to deal with.
Yeah. Short-tempered and being short-tempered and under pressure, vice versa.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it too.
So it might be a good idea to start paying attention to that sector of your chart as we get the buildup as soon as Mars ingresses in the middle of the month into Cancer and starts moving into that opposition very slowly with Saturn, for some of those themes to sort of start coming up and maybe to start being a little more cautious in that area of your life.
Yeah, and I think one of you mentioned this, that the flip side of that is things get a little bit better for Jupiter as soon as Mars moves out of Gemini, because Jupiter is not dealing with, you know, the Saturn problems because it's in a blind spot, and Jupiter now no longer has that thorn in its side kind of energy of Mars being in the sign opposite.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the last aspects I see of the month is Mercury opposing Jupiter around May 30th or 31st from 20 Gemini to 20 Sagittarius.
Yes.
And that's basically how we close off the month.
Yeah, the only other aspect that I might throw in just to get your guys' take on it, there is a trine from Venus to Saturn
Right.
with a lot of dignity, because obviously Venus is in her home sign, Saturn is in his home sign. I don't know. I'm kind of like that for a bit of stabilizing, kind of grounded energy.
I think so.
I wasn't sure if you guys agreed or had a different take.
Yeah, definitely a trine between those two more almost like quasi-earthy planets taking place in Earth signs. Like that's a very grounded and stabilizing trine, and it nicely helps to liven up and smooth out Saturn a little bit in a way that it's otherwise not a lot of this time in Capricorn as it's retrograde conjunct Pluto in the South Node.
Yeah, I would also look at it that way primarily, is that's help with the Saturn stuff.
Absolutely. And I mean, we didn't harp on it a lot, but Venus in Taurus is one of the little blessings from the sky this month of May. And we have almost 4 weeks of her. I'm actually excited to have her go over Uranus, because I'm interested to see how the Uranus stuff develops or emerges with the Venus-Uranus conjunction. I'm interested to see news headlines when that comes out, but also the personal life developments. But yeah, that Venus trine Saturn, very end of the month. The moon is actually in Taurus on the same day with Uranus, so that might take off. I don't know whether we get more Uranus or more Taurus, but there's a little bit of stability coming in there. It's the week after Norwalk, so I sort of think I'll be home in my garden and I'll be honoring Venus there.
It's like the day after Norwalk.
Yeah.
Like that, it's gonna, I guess it's the couple days home. Yeah, I like that. And one of the reasons, when I talk about the Mars, the malefic party, and I say I've never said, it begins in May as soon as Mars moves into Taurus.
No, you never said that.
Sorry, Mars moves into Cancer, is because if we're looking for where the trouble is, I would say wait until Venus moves out of Taurus, because Venus in Taurus is just going to have this. It's just going to be in the sky. It's going to rise once a day. It's going to culminate once a day. And so we have this stabilizing, cohering power. And then when Venus moves into Gemini, we lose that, and we lose any configuration to the difficulty axis here. And that's where the malefic party will get to shine all on its own.
Yeah, so enjoy Venus and Taurus while we have her.
Yeah, and stabilize things,
Yeah, that's an opportunity to stabilize things and to firm things up before some of the tumultuousness of the next month and a half.
Yep.
Cool.
Good advice. All right. Nice. Well, I think that brings us pretty much to the end. Those are the last alignments of the month. And at that point, we're getting into June and other stuff that we are going to have to wait. Yeah, because look at that. Mercury changes signs really fast afterwards. Then the moon goes in very early in June, and then we start getting the build up to all of that.
Yeah, there's a very clear shift in that direction. Two things really quick, just to hit again that happened in May. One, the opposition between Mercury and Jupiter also has a partner in Neptune. Neptune is tightly square both of them while that occurs.
Yeah.
And so, there's a note of confusion or lack of clarity, or just very big dreaming that can't be ignored there. It might be possible to get excited about ideas that aren't going to happen then, or ideas that are going to take a lot of energy to actually make happen. Neptune gives you that biggest of all possible circles and possibilities, which doesn't always work out. And then just one note on that full moon in Scorpio with Venus conjunct Uranus, that could be a little crazy.
Oh, it's going to be crazy.
It's going to be a little crazy. We didn't give that one the crazy stamp. It could be crazy good. That Venus Uranus for some people is going to pop out some crazy good stuff. It's also going to pop out some crazy bad stuff, and it's also going to just pop out some crazy stuff. But crazy tending in many different directions, full moon.
Yeah, it's a pretty dramatic weekend for sure. So make sure people have that marked in their diary.
And it's right after that shift of Mars into Cancer as well. So that's like an element of it that's tinging things as well.
Mm-hmm.
Of course.
Right, because Mars rules Scorpio, and so it's and that's actually a mutual reception. Now that you pointed out,
yeah,
right. Good times. All right,
and
guys.
The Algol activation. So yeah, take care, be safe, don't lose your head.
Yeah, or maybe stow it somewhere safe where you can retrieve, where you'll put it somewhere where you're going to remember where you hit it, so you can recover it intact later.
Right.
Beautiful. And if you're in New York, I hope to see you in person that weekend, and we can lose our heads in a good way together.
What are the dates on that again?
It's May 18. It's just a full day workshop on the Saturday. I think it's 10 till 4:30 or 5 through the NCGR. And if you Google Kelly Surtees New York Astrology, I think it comes right up, or if you put NCGR in there. And I can get the link actually if we want that in the show notes.
Sure. Yeah. So just search for the New York NCGR chapter, and then you'll be able to find out more information about it. Okay, cool. So you'll be there. We're going to all be at NORWAC. We're going to do that Q&A. Everybody be sure to send us questions. Send us good questions. Like, think of the best question you could possibly ask us that would make for a good discussion topic about astrology or something related to astrology. And we will answer some of the best ones we get. That's going to be a lot of fun. I'm actually looking forward to seeing both of you. I've been hanging out with friends here from
You're getting a taste.
Yeah. Well, hanging out with Kenneth and Sam Reynolds this week reminded me of what it's like to be at a conference, and like having the new studio and being able to have conversations here in person has reminded me of like what it's actually like hanging out with astrologers in person and like talking and getting into crazy conversations. So that's going to be a really fun week that I'm looking forward to.
Yeah. Yeah. No, so we'll see each other in person probably before we talk online again. Unless we pre-record. I'm not sure what we're doing scheduling with June, but we'll see each other again.
Yeah, like soon. 3.5 weeks.
Yeah. All right, cool, guys. Well, I'm really excited. I'm looking forward to everything. Is there anything else we need to mention really quickly before we wrap up? Do you got anything, Austin? I guess you've mentioned.
Just quick reminder, talk on the Jupiter-Saturn cycle online on May 5th. Tickets for As Above 2019 Portland event with me and Gordon White on September 14th. 85% sold out. It's only been up for a little over a week. If you're going to come, you got to get in now. And the Sphere and Sundry Venus Exaltation series that I elected goes live on May 2nd. And come see us at NORWAC. Actually, no more tickets available. So we'll see you all at NORWAC.
Yeah, so NORWAC is sold out. Laura, the organizer, did tell me that there is a waiting list. So if anybody's really wanting to get into NORWAC, there's some off chance that you might be able to get a ticket. If you go to the NORWAC, Northwest Astrology Conference website, which I think is like norwac.net or something like that. You can find Laura's email address, and she said just to email her to be put on the waiting list in case some tickets free up, because sometimes people cancel at the last minute and then there's extra tickets floating around. So otherwise, we look forward to seeing everybody at NORWAC here in a few weeks. And yeah, I guess that's it for this episode.
Yeah, we'll see them at the live podcast episode or recording.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's going to be so much fun. And Cameron White's going to be there. He's going to help us set up. Last time we were there, we got lucky, and your husband was there, Kelly, and he like saved us in
He
setting
helped
up at the
out.
last
I think
minute.
Tony helped out too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cam is amazing. Don't let he and I behind the bar, because we will have everyone in a very merry mood.
Yeah, that's what I heard. And I think Cam is also going to try to, he's like a DJ, and he's going to try to do the dance party at NORWAC. There's going to be so many new people that are having their first conferences. Do you guys have any advice for astrologers at their first conference?
Oh,
I would say get into the bookstore early, because like there's going to be this huge, amazing bookstore with thousands of astrology books and lots of titles you've never seen. But sometimes, like if you hit the bookstore early, you can get some of the best ones right at the top before they sell out.
totally. I would
Go
say
ahead.
pace yourself, and sometimes so there are great conversations that happen between the lectures in the hallways. So make a little bit of room for that if you can. Sorry, Austin.
Oh, I was gonna say, crew up. You know, if you get having a few conference buddies, is a lot of fun. You can go around and do stuff together and see lectures together, and squad or crew up. You'll enjoy it.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and try to make the effort. Kelly, you and I met actually, and everything that's happened in our friendship over the past decade happened because you came up to me at NORWAC in New Orleans in 2012 and just like started chatting me up.
UAC. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's actually my best piece of advice to anybody going to the conference is make the effort to like reach out to other people. Or if you see somebody that seems like they're not connecting with other people, like go up to them and introduce yourself. And that sort of networking is really important at conferences. And I hope everybody does that, because that's part of what helps to ensure that everybody has a good time, is just like meeting other astrologers. And it may be more or less difficult for different people. So try to make the effort. And sometimes if you do, it can lead to crazy things like, Austin and Kelly and I doing this conference now, or doing this podcast now for years.
Yeah, and as an addendum to my advice, like, if you've got a couple of people you're hanging out with and you see somebody lonely, like break them along,
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, and that's a really good point, that everything that we do together now is because we met at a conference.
Yeah. And Austin, you and I met because I invited you out to the first Project Hindsight conference, just having exchanged a few messages with you on MySpace back in the day.
Yep.
Yeah. So everybody try to do that, try to make an effort. And hopefully, especially for the podcast listeners, we're hoping that can be a good event at the start of the conference to introduce other people that listen to the podcast. And right off the bat, that you have something that you share in common. So that's why I'm looking forward to it. All right, guys, that's it for this episode of the Astrology Podcast. Thanks everybody for listening. Thanks to our audience. We had like 30 or 40 people in here for the live recording of this. We appreciate all your comments. Sorry if we couldn't get to all of them. I was trying to keep track as we go, but yeah, thanks for joining us for that. Thanks to all the patrons who support the podcast and who have supported us through 200 episodes. I did the 200th episode this month. I am now moved into the new studio, and we are starting to do in-person interviews. So those should be more of that in the future. All right. So thanks everyone for listening, and we will see you next time.
Bye, everyone.